Yeah, Lewis Goodall joins me, presenter of Sundays with Lewis Goodall and co-host of Global's podcast, The Newsagents. That was a classic example in Keir Starmer's answer there, wasn't it, of a politician, and he does this a lot, not wanting to particularly answer the questions. So you can almost, it's like a wind-up doll, and then out comes the litany of things he wants to say instead. It's a bit of an unsatisfactory answer, isn't it?
It is an unsatisfactory answer, Sheila. And to be honest, the Prime Minister, on this question, obviously, which has always sort of emanated and flowed from Mandelson, and obviously he's had a series of unsatisfactory responses because, as we talked about at the time, to be honest, there is no real response other than the truth, which we know, which is, I mean, he can say, of course, that he claims that Mandelson lied to him about the extent of his relationship with Epstein. But we know that the Prime Minister, because he confirmed it, was aware of the relationship. And the truth is, I think it's fair to say that, as we discussed at the time, that the Prime Minister decided to appoint him cognizant of that because he thought that the win of the national interest in appointing him to the court of Trump was going to be worth it for any of the kind of moral squeamishness he and others might have had about Mandelson's relationship with Epstein. And that's the truth, and it's one that he can't really get away from. And Kemi Badenoch is correct about that.
And let's talk about the so-called parliamentary language here, because it's important to say, I think, that the daughter of the murdered Conservative MP, Sir David Amess, has commented on this. And she said that this kind of language, inflammatory language, strong language, being brought into the House of Commons, she calls it dangerous. She thinks it's irresponsible. And I would agree with her. And I think yesterday, that was the worst example of it. But I think there were other examples as well, where one Bradford MP referred to Reform UK as this lot. And the Prime Minister himself spoke of Sir Ed Davey as that bloke over there. And just to my ears, that was, I remember thinking, why isn't Sir Lindsay Hoyle saying, this is unparliamentary language, mind how you address one another in here. It's not for nothing, in my view. I mean, what's your take on that?
What you mean in terms of Parliament?
Standards,
yeah, well, look, I mean, it is true to say, it is curious, isn't it, Sheila, because Parliament does have a very particular way of doing things. As listeners and viewers will know, you can't refer to another member of Parliament by their name. You have to address them through the chair. That is for reasons of civility. You can't accuse another member of the House of Parliament, another member of Parliament of being a liar, which is where, of course, one of the reasons we've got the phrase, being economical with the truth. They have to kind of invent ways of doing these things. So you can't accuse an MP of being a liar, but you can basically accuse them of being a paedophile protector or being part of the paedophile protection party or defenders party, whatever particular phrase it was that Kemi Badenoch has used. And I think what you can certainly say, look, there are two things. You can sort of overdo some of the parliamentary civility. It's true to say that the House of Commons, it's a rough and tumble kind of place. It always has been. When you have Dennis Healey famously saying, for example, of Geoffrey Howe, that it's like, being addressed by him is like being ravaged by a dead sheep, or things like this. There's always been a quite inventive way of being pretty hostile and being pretty aggressive and making your point. And I think we like that, I think, in Britain. It's part of British political culture.
I'm not asking for it to be tame and dry and desiccated.
If you look at places like the United States Congress or parliaments all over the world, they are basically almost sort of crematoria. They are basically places where people make speeches in empty parliamentary chambers virtually, just for the record, and there is no back and forth. We don't have that. We've got a more robust tradition, and I think that is important. I think what is changing, and I think this is for the worse, I think what we're seeing to some extent is the kind of memification, in a way, of Parliament and the House of Commons. We're seeing kind of online discourse and online memes and online ways of doing things.
What will catch on social media?
In two respects. One is it's, I think, undoubtedly true to say that in a way that never used to be the case, much as they do when they're on the media, and let's be honest, what we do when we're interviewing politicians, what's the kind of currency of politics today? The currency of politics today is not making a particularly thoughtful speech in the House of Commons most of the time. It's not even necessarily building up to a great kind of peroration as part of your 6 questions if you're the leader of the opposition. It's about the clip. It's about the clip, not just as it has been for a long time on the sort of 10 o'clock news or whatever it happens to be, but the clip that can be pumped out on Instagram and on X and on social media. And it's that bit of, wow, did they really just say that? And there's a kind of cumulative process to that. So I think that's one thing that's going on. And I also think, frankly, politics is becoming more conspiratorial, just like the electorate is. It's becoming more suspicious of elites. It's becoming sort of more ill-tempered. And in particular, I mean, when I say the kind of memification, one of the things that has obsessed the sort of darker corners of the internet and has obviously been thrust in the more centrally as a result of the Epstein files is this, repeated accusation around of paedophilia and sexual abuse and defenders of sexual abusers and so on. And we've seen this sort of gradually become more and more central over the last few years. And to be honest, Labour are to some extent in glass houses, of course, aren't they? Because we will remember, Sheila, in 2024, when Labour itself put out that internet image saying, do you think adults convicted of sexually assaulting children should go to prison? Rishi Sunak doesn't, with a picture of Rishi Sunak.
I remember being shocked at that.
Indeed so. So this is part, I think, of a kind of cumulative process which is going on, which is
denigration.
The coarsening of politics for sure, and I think in particular around this question of particular politicians or parties being in some way not necessarily defenders of, but relaxed about sexual abuse. And the truth, of course, is that most politicians, when they make that accusation, know that the vast majority of politicians aren't comfortable with sexual abuse. They are concerned about sexual abuse. They are concerned about predation. Of course, you can make particular critiques and criticisms of whether individual politicians have given it enough importance, or in Keir Starmer's case, whether he put it down his kind of hierarchy of priorities in what he did about Mandelson. Of course you can. But I do think, as I say, it speaks to the kind of memification of politics and the kind of way that the sort of internet discourse is becoming more and more mainstream within politics.
And while I have you here, assisted dying is the topic that we're talking about this hour, and it's in the Lords. Esther Rantzen furious at what she says is them just essentially talking it out of time. Where are we up to here? Because it's been, right from the start, it's been beset by criticism, not least the way in which it was brought to Parliament as a private member's bill rather than a government bill.
Yes. Well, look, I mean, I think it's very likely now, and I think the advocates of assisted dying basically saying today, or making it be known today, that they think that the bill is almost certain to fail because, let's be clear, it's been talked out in the House of Lords. It's passed pretty much all of its common stages, the House of Commons, by an increasingly slender majority, has to be said, but has made clear each and every time that it wants this legislation to go through. The House of Lords, which of course is a revising chamber of our constitution, has put down, and this in particular comes from about a dozen or so members of the Lords, some well known, some much more obscure, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of amendments to each stage of the bill, and that they have had to be discussed and debated and so on. And because it's a private member's bill, and because this is the way legislation works generally, because basically it has to pass before the end of this session of Parliament, which I think is in May, then if it doesn't get through all of its stages in Parliament, both in the Commons and Lords, then the bill falls, unless the government were to take it up again in future. And so we talked out. And look, I think the private members' bill process, which is basically, for listeners who don't know, this is basically where an MP wins a ballot or comes near to the top of the ballot and gets a chance, a backbench MP, of guaranteed pretty much parliamentary time to basically craft a piece of legislation of their choosing. This is unusual in our system because normally the government controls the House of Commons agenda. Now, this helps, of course, if the government in some senses sort of get behind it or at least remain neutral on it, which they've done in this case. But it is the Lords, through, I think what many people would say has been a deliberate strategy from some peers, not just to improve the bill, which is their job, but to torpedo the bill, to basically filibuster it and to clog it up with so many unnecessary amendments as to basically talk it out. And I think that clearly, look, I have no doubt whatsoever that the advocates of that approach and those peers who have put down some amendments, even many amendments, think they're doing so for the right reasons, such as their moral and political concerns about how this legislation would operate in practice. But I think that there will be people with serious concerns that there is a really fine line between the amelioration of this bill, the improvement
They'll
of
see
this
it as
bill,
overreach,
and the motives that might otherwise be in place, which was always to destroy this bill and ensure that it never reached the statute book. And I do think that that does pose serious constitutional questions in future if this is always going to be the means by which we actually get to pieces of legislation like this, i.e. via the private members' bill process. Because if that is the way, it seems to me that it will never, ever happen.
I think that was the first, for those who wish this to come to pass, that's the first mistake, making it a private members' bill, I think. Do you think it will come back as a government bill?
But the problem is, I think the precedent has been set, and I don't think this is necessarily very satisfactory, but the precedent has been set for a long time now that these so-called, matters of conscience and so on
don't come back
will be determined. Well, will be determined by the private members process rather than a government bill. Now, for all sorts of reasons, I don't think that is very satisfactory, but I can't really see the appetite from a future government necessarily to bring it back in this way. That said, of course, it is entirely possible that we reach the end of this process with different regimes across the UK on this, because Scotland has taken up its own version of the legislation, so as well. So we end up potentially in a situation where Scotland, for example, is likely to have assisted dying, but England doesn't.
Yeah, and the Isle of Man does, and Jersey has.
And Jersey,
today.
yes, indeed so. Yep.
Thanks very much, Lewis. Lewis Goodall, host of the Newsagents podcast. Don't forget the latest episode drops at 5 o'clock today. You can listen or watch it, of course, download it on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app. It's